All right. This is Alan Brinkley, The Unfinished Nation, Chapter 30, From the Age of Limits to Reaganism. Please note that if you are using an earlier edition of the book, 8th or before, this will appear as Chapter 31, those earlier editions. So this chapter opens up with the post-Watergate world, and recall that the Watergate scandal had led to Richard Nixon, the president, his resignation. And Nixon's resignation was the first and last time that a president had ever stepped down from office. And it completely tarnished, the Watergate scandal more broadly, completely tarnished his legacy. We also have to recall that the United States is post-Vietnam, or at least very close to post-Vietnam. As far as American involvement goes, it's just about over. So this kind of combination of kind of a questionable involvement in the Vietnam War, the fact that there were aspects of the Vietnam War that the American public was misled about, combined with Richard Nixon's resignation and all the things that were going on behind the scenes as far as the Watergate scandal. This is what we mean by the age of limits, right? The 1970s. We might even factor in, in some cases, the economy too, because the economy of the 1970s was not so well. So Americans were understanding what the limit of American affluence, American involvement overseas, presidential power. There weren't really a lot of things that Americans could essentially feel good about towards the end of or I guess early 1970s. Now, upon Richard Nixon's resignation, Gerald Ford became the next president of the United States. So the Ford custodianship is now Nixon's out, Gerald Ford is in. And kind of a fun fact about Gerald Ford, sort of a trivia kind of thing. Ford was actually the Speaker of the House. Was Ford. The president, of course, was Richard Nixon. Oops, put that for sake of consistency. Richard Nixon. But the vice president was a guy named Spiro Agnew. He was vice president. So, because of a series of unlikely events, Ford found himself becoming the only president to ever hold that office without actually ever appearing on an election. So what had happened was Spiro Agnew had to resign because he was involved in some sort of corruption. Richard Nixon had to resign because of Watergate. And then Ford, as Speaker of the House, never having run on a ticket, either president or vice president, he now became the next president of the United States. Now, as far as Ford's presidency goes, I would say there's probably really only one thing that that you need to know about it, and that is what position he would take on Nixon and the Watergate scandal. And Ford's response was that he issued an absolute pardon for Richard Nixon. So we might say about this, Ford pardoned Nixon. So they would not face any criminal charges. Even though Nixon had resigned the presidency, there was still a question about whether or not Nixon broke the law, and there was a possibility that maybe Richard Nixon would be sent to jail or something along those lines. Ford did, for some anyways, a controversial thing, and that was to grant him a complete pardon, meaning that Richard Nixon would not go to jail or face any type of charges for alleged crimes that he had committed. One of the reasons why Ford did this, and as it was sort of phrased at the time, he wanted to put kind of everything behind the country and kind of focus on the future. And so it was said after Nixon's pardon, our long national nightmare is over. Our long national nightmare is over. Watergate ran its course. Nixon resigned. It's time for the country to move on and not to continue to pursue Nixon on perhaps any sort of criminal charges. Besides that, though, the rest of Ford's presidency is rather uneventful. The United States continues to suffer from stagflation. That has to do with the economy. It is a combination of high inflation and high unemployment. The 1970s are not generally considered to be a good economic period. And what makes stagflation especially difficult is that oftentimes the remedy for one of these things means making the other one worse. So if you want to battle high unemployment, you need to stimulate the economy. Stimulating the economy makes inflation worse. If you want to help inflation, you need to contract the economy. But contracting the economy makes unemployment work. So it's a very kind of difficult economic position to be in. And Ford, continued to try and deal with the crisis, but could not do so very effectively. And so the 1976 election was, shaping up really to be kind of a referendum on what had happened during the past, 4 or 5 years with the ending of the Vietnam War and Nixon's resignation. And the two political parties that were running was Ford. He was running as the Republican, as the incumbent, but he was running against a very kind of unlikely presidential candidate, and that was Jimmy Carter. And Jimmy Carter was unlikely because he was a political outsider. He wasn't accustomed to kind of the standard politics of the era. And in fact, that's why Americans chose Jimmy Carter, who ultimately won this election. Jimmy Carter defeated Ford. And not only was Carter not considered like a standard politician for the time period, but he was also, an honest guy, kind of the honest candidate. He ran on the slogan, "I will not lie to you." And of course, given the past decade, the lies over Vietnam, the lies that Richard Nixon was telling in order to cover himself up, that appealed to Carter. But Carter faced a lot of difficulties as president, and it's largely considered that he didn't have a very successful presidency. First and foremost, the economy continued to worsen, and seemingly nothing that either really Nixon, Ford, or Carter could do in order to improve it. But Carter also, it's true he was an honest guy, and he ran on the slogan, "I will not lie to you." He wasn't the greatest politician, and in fact, he didn't present himself all that great to the American public. So, for example, when he told Americans that he would not lie to you, he was, he's telling the truth about that. Carter gave what was known as the quote unquote malice speech. And in that speech, he pretty much told Americans things, you know, things were bad, especially with the economy, and might not get better. And as far as being a leader, that's not really what Americans want to hear, right? Americans don't want to hear, yeah, well, it's pretty bad right now, and it'll probably get worse in the future. Hate to break it to you guys, but Americans want to be told, things are improving. What are you doing to make things better? So, being honest was maybe Carter was a little bit too honest, especially when it came to things like the economy. Telling the public everything's going to be okay might have been politically the better thing to do than kind of telling Americans, yeah, things are pretty bad. Now, as far as domestic goes, the worsening economy is going to continue to be a big problem for Carter. His inability to kind of play politics, again, he's not a traditional politician, also kind of hampers his presidency. But there's also things going on overseas, and the things overseas don't get much better as far as the Carter presidency is concerned. However, though, if you wanted to point to a bright spot of the Carter presidency, and really just Jimmy Carter more broadly, is his position on human rights. And we can definitely say that this is probably Carter's maybe like strongest attribute. And this is also true since Carter's been president. He's been very aggressive in kind of um, giving back to charities and doing or being part of humanitarian efforts. And so, two things that we can point to that you might say are kind of on the more positive side of maybe Carter's administration. One of them had to do with the Panama Canal, and that was Carter, you could say, gave back the canal to Panama. And this was a way of kind of leading by example. Up until this point, and this was true under the Nixon presidency, and going back to the Bay of Pigs, and even during the era of imperialism, is that the United States didn't respect the sovereignty of Latin American countries very well. Franklin Roosevelt famously had a good neighbor policy to try and like rebuild the relationship between Latin America and the United States. And so, one thing that Carter wanted to signal was that the United States was going to, in the future, kind of do a better job of governing with Latin America through consent. And by giving back the Panama Canal to the country of Panama, more than anything else, this could symbolize that, right? Kind of respect of Latin American sovereignty. But probably his most significant accomplishment is the Camp David Accords. And this was a peace agreement between Egypt and Israel. And it's not it's sort of covered in passing in this text. But since Israel was founded in 1948, they had gone to war 3 times with their Arab neighbors. You originally had the 1948 war, which is the war that established Israel as an independent country. You had the Six-Day War in the 1960s. And then you had the Yom Kippur War. And so, to say that the relationship between Israel and their neighbors wasn't good is certainly an understatement. I mean, the two sides, the Arabs and Israelis, had been at war with each other, again, about every decade or so since Israel's inception. And so, for Carter to be able to stand here in the middle and create an agreement between Egypt and Israel, which really were the two leading nations, that was if anything, even though it didn't lead to look like a lasting peace in the Middle East, it was a considerable accomplishment considering the very brief history from 1948 up until that point. However, though, as far as foreign policy goes, more of it was bad than good. And probably the most significant area which this occurred was in the country of Iran. Now, recall that in an earlier chapter, we had mentioned that in the 1950s, the CIA, helped depose. His name was Mohammed Mossadegh. I'm definitely getting his name wrong, so apologies for that. Who was democratically, we'll say democratic elected leader in Iran. And this was done with the help of, the British Secret Service. The Iranians were threatening to nationalize their resources. That was, they were going to kick out all foreign businesses, including British and American businesses. Mossadegh was also suspected of being too close to the Soviet Union. So for reasons of geopolitics and wanting to, prevent communism in Iran, the CIA helped get rid of a democratically elected leader. And so in the meantime, after Mossadegh, the Shah of Iran was installed. And this is the pro-US leader in Iran. And he more or less was in power from the 1950s until 1979. Now, as far as the Shah goes, the Shah was good from the perspective of the United States. He was anti-communist. He allowed Americans to do business. Iran even culturally looked a lot more similar to the kind of Western nations than it did to other, predominantly Islamic nations in the Middle East. But the Shah was not well liked by Iranians. He was essentially seen as a puppet. He didn't, kind of influenced by outsiders, too much foreign influence. And so there were several reasons as to why Iranians wanted to get rid of the Shah, and there were several factions. You had those who were anti-imperialists, you had those who were fundamentalist religion, you had those who were communists, legitimate communists. And so all of this came together in the Iranian Revolution in 1979. And the Iranian Revolution was an event where the Shah was deposed. Right, so the pro-US leader of Iran was effectively kicked out. And the question was, well, what's going to be the future for Iran, right, as their government? And of all the factions that were fighting over kind of control of Iran after the Shah was kicked out, it was ultimately the religious fundamentalists that gained control, and they were led by Ayatollah Khomeini. So he was the leader of the, we'll just call it the, we'll call it the fundamentalists. Say Islam faction in Iran. And they ended up winning or won, just say, control of the country. And they were very much anti-US and Western. Now, the thing is, they were also pretty anti-communist. Again, this is going to be a kind of a changing pattern as far as geopolitics go, and that is kind of a shift away from the Cold War. From the perspective of the United States, they can really only see, red and blue. It's either communist or capitalist, but especially in some parts of the Middle East, there's a growing sentiment around fundamentalist Islam, and we'll also kind of see how this plays out in places like Afghanistan. Now, for the Americans that were in Iran during the revolution, many of them were taken hostage, and this sparked off the hostage crisis. And this is we'll say the 53 Americans taken hostage in Iran during the revolution. And this became a huge national crisis. And the question was, what was Jimmy Carter going to do about it? Well, Carter helped to organize a rescue mission for the hostages, but the Carter ordered rescue mission failed. In fact, the helicopter crashed, I believe, in a sandstorm, and a number of American military personnel actually died. And because Carter had attempted to rescue the hostages, which like this covert top secret mission, the Ayatollah Khomeini and the Iranians were no longer willing to negotiate with Carter. So this ended up being a pretty big stain on Carter's presidency. His inability to get back the American hostages would end up kind of haunting his legacy. The hostages remained in capture, remain in Iran, I'll just say Iran, for over a year. The second thing that went very poorly for Carter as far as his foreign policy goes is the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And this was seen as being an aggressive move by the Soviet Union. So we'll just say Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Probably the thing that we can note about this is that this conflict ended up, I mean, they didn't know at the time. I mean, it looked like at the time when the Soviets invaded that Carter had failed containment, right? And Americans did not want to go into Afghanistan to try and prevent the Soviets from attacking, so they kind of just let them in. But it actually ended up being a very bad idea by the Soviet Union and contributing to the downfall of their country. But this conflict ended up being, let's say, the Vietnam or the Soviet Union. We'll say in the meantime, we'll just say maybe seen as a failure of Carter to contain communism. So the combination of the Shah getting kicked out, American hostages not being freed, the Soviets on the march, expanding their territory, couple that with a bad economy, and Carter is going to end up being just a one-term president. So Carter's, the trials of Carter and his presidency are certainly one side of it, but a second side to really, really what becomes kind of the defining theme of the 1980s is the rise of a new conservative movement. We talked earlier in a chapter called The New Left. And the New Left was a type of politics that focused on things like environmentalism, civil rights, identity movements. The New Left was anti-war, anti-Vietnam War. The 1980s give us a new right. And this is a type of politics that is much more ideologically driven. If we think about the earlier Republicans before the emergence of the new right in the 1980s, it's Richard Nixon and Dwight Eisenhower who were not ideologically driven. The new right is going to be driven more by ideas, and it kind of gives us, in some ways, a much more modern sense of conservatism. So there were several reasons or several things that contributed to this new right movement, and we'll talk about it in a little bit more detail. One important kind of social change going on is the growth of the Sun Belt, and that is, we'll just say really we'll use this map here from 1970 to 1990. Populations shifted south and west to the quote-unquote Sun Belt states. And Sun Belt, you can just think of as states where the sun shines. And so this map is trying to show you the way that Americans moved across the country in this period. So the states in purple and blue saw an increase in population. Everything else saw a decrease. So people were moving to California. California was a big Sun Belt state, more people moving there. Texas is a Sun Belt state, a lot of people moving there. And Florida, a big Sun Belt state. So you end up seeing this reflected in things like the Electoral College, for example, whereas historically, if you look at the states that had the most electoral votes, the states that had the biggest population, it was New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. In fact, this is sometimes, I don't know, mockingly is the right word, but sometimes this migration is also referred to as the Rust Belt to Sun Belt migration. And the idea is that back in the 1950s, during the affluent society period, in fact, it was this area up here by Ohio and Michigan and Wisconsin and, Philadelphia. That's where a lot of manufacturing was. Think about maybe all the auto producers in Detroit. But as those factories closed down and as they went overseas, Americans moved out and those factories became rusty, hence the Rust Belt. So Americans abandoned the manufacturing center of the country and moved to the Sun Belt, California, Texas, and California, Texas, and Florida. Did I already say that? Instead, right, during this period. And in some of these Western states, you began to see some of the elements of the new conservative movement emerge. One of them is an anti-environmentalism, and this is part of the Sagebrush Rebellion. So this was sort of a series, we'll say, of a series of voter measures against environmental, say, regulations. That's a good one. And as part of the new conservative movement, definitely sort of an anti-environmentalist stance. I mean, I don't think that they would say they're anti-environmentalist. I think they would just say that they're more pro-business, or allow businesses to decide to what extent the environment should be polluted. And so, sort of on a local level, we can kind of see this leg of the new conservative movement beginning to emerge. Another emerging leg of the new conservative movement of the 1980s is in religion or culture. And it is the mobilization of specifically evangelical Christians that provide the new right or the new conservative movement with probably its strongest voting base. Now, the United States has always been a religious country, but religion never really was kind of a determining factor in terms of casting one's vote. Or to put it another way, religious groups were never maybe entirely politically mobilized. Now there's some exceptions to this. Protestant Christians certainly had candidates they supported, but the religious right or the evangelical right in the United States from the 1980s onwards is arguably the largest and most influential religious base, and they're choosing their political candidates based off of their religious convictions. That's priority number one. So typically, the types of Christians that supported the New Right movement were evangelicals, and evangelicals, has or requires a personal, let's say, conversion and salvation. Sometimes these are called born again Christians. And very popular in places like the South, Midwest, and rural parts of the country. And certain religious leaders, not only captured the American public imagination, but mobilized them to vote in specific issues. So some of the most famous ministers of the religious right were people like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson. So you can see Jerry Falwell here. And they utilized the television to garner national audiences. These were sort of like celebrities in some respect. They popularized the term. Let's say popularized the quote unquote Christian right. Christianity became synonymous with conservative politics. And again, the thing that's kind of fundamentally different here, or at least more intense than in previous years, is the connection between religiosity, religious organizations, and political organizations. I mean, it is a religious movement, but it's also just as much as a political movement. So, for example, organizations like the Christian Coalition, this was an organization, specifically a political organization, to elect politicians that shared same, and they use this term, so it's a good term to note, traditional values. As, we'll say, evangelicals. So it's very important for the religious right to know that their political candidates subscribe to the same type of religious beliefs that they did. And if they could be properly vetted by groups like the Christian Coalition, then you could get, Jerry Falwell or Pat Robertson could tell their millions of followers, say, look, let's go elect this guy, or let's go raise money for this guy. He shares our values. Traditional values, what does traditional values mean? Well, they can mean different things to different people, but broadly speaking, we're talking about positions that are, anti-abortion is probably a big one. Also kind of anti-pornography, anti-gay. I don't even think that even people in the 1980s and 1990s would necessarily even disagree with that. I mean, some of it was very much open. Also, supported things like prayer in the classroom. So, these are sometimes called, and I'm not sure if your textbook uses this, this term, but at the time, these were called the culture wars. All right. So these are not issues related to like the economy. They're not issues related to foreign policy. There are a lot of different reasons as to why you might vote for a politician, right? You might want to vote for them to improve the economy, or you have better job standards, or whatever it is, or you might want to vote for them to get out of the Vietnam War, fight the Cold War harder, or whatever it may be. But the religious right, they were the ones concerned with sort of these things, right? What is your stance on abortion? What is your stance on, homosexuality and whatnot? And in order to garner that votes, Republican candidates, made themselves appeal to the religious right, who again, arguably the largest and most powerful voting bloc in the country. So, with with an unpopular president currently in Jimmy Carter, with a growing religious right, kind of a cultural resurgence, a quote unquote great awakening, you may say. And this term great awakening is often invoked in the United States whenever there's a huge religious revival. There's somewhat maybe of a great awakening in the 1980s. You might be able to say that. It was time for a candidate to kind of bring the pieces together and run for office. And that candidate was Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan, more so than really anybody else. I mean, you'd probably have to go back to maybe John Kennedy. Before that, Franklin Roosevelt. Before that, maybe somebody like, let's see, who would be before Franklin Roosevelt? Andrew Jackson, maybe. More so than anyone, a president who defined a decade. In fact, so much so that the title of this section includes his namesake, that is Reaganism. And pretty much every single textbook that you find on American history in the 1980s will more or less title that entire chapter by him. Ronald Reagan became what's called the face of the new right, or new conservative movement. Ronald Reagan himself had actually previously been a New Deal Democrat, a supporter of Franklin Roosevelt. In his day job, Ronald Reagan was a movie star. And so, one of the great attributes that Reagan had as presidency was kind of that movie star charisma. Interesting thing about Ronald Reagan is that he was in Hollywood when HUAC was questioning people about whether or not they were communists. So you can actually see him pop up in the historical record. He was interrogated by the HUAC. But he had served as a governor in California, and in 1976 actually challenged Gerald Ford. Didn't win, but challenged him and nearly won, got a lot of popularity. Reagan ends up kind of creating this new right, or this new right kind of mobilizes beneath him. But a lot of the ideas behind this new conservative right actually came from an earlier candidate, and that was Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater was the Republican. He was the candidate in the 1964 election. He lost that badly. But is kind of like the pioneer of the new, the conservative idea. Right, so he's kind of considered like a forefather. Is that the right word? A founding father? Um, a pioneer. We'll keep it simple. A pioneer of the new right or the new conservative movement. So let's start to put these sort of pieces together as far as who makes up. And so, on the one hand, we have who we mentioned earlier, kind of the anti-environmentalist. They are certainly part of it, not a big part of it. A big part is the religious right, just mentioned. Those that they vote based off of where you stand on issues like traditional values in their rights. Reagan is also going to have the help of the tax revolters, and the tax revolt was a series of like local a series of local level, say, laws and propositions to repeal and lower taxes. Kind of like the Sagebrush Rebellion. Now, there are a couple reasons as to why Americans were demanding lower taxes. I mean, one, we can kind of point to the fact that Vietnam and Watergate had, and that is, Americans, broadly speaking, have less trust and faith in governments than they did before, at least for the government to do good. But also, it's sometimes it's the simplest answer is the most correct one, and that was the economy was just much worse, right? Inflation was starting to take its toll, and things were getting more and more and more expensive. And so, as Americans thrived less, taxes hit them harder. And so, wanting to repeal taxes was in some sense also an offshoot of economy. Now, Reagan runs against Carter in 1980, and this is an election of Reagan, the Republican, versus Carter, the Democrat. And it was a campaign that Reagan won in 1980 pretty handily, and that put an end to Jimmy Carter's presidency. Upon his election, because Carter's failed rescue mission, the Iranians were willing to negotiate with Reagan, and in fact, Reagan negotiated the release of the hostage crisis. The hostage crisis ended when Reagan took office. And you can see from the electoral map here that it was, one in which Reagan's in the red here, kind of reminiscent of the 1972 election that, that Richard Nixon won. So when Reagan came into office, the Reagan Revolution, as they called it, had begun, because this was the first president that was espousing ideas related to this new right, new republicanism. One way to kind of summarize Reagan's presidency and Reagan's outlook, probably the quote that best encapsulates this is when Reagan said that government is not the solution to our problems. Government is the problem. Government is the problem. So Reagan captured this sentiment that Americans had been kind of more suspicious of their government than they were in the past. And sort of the small government message was more appealing in a post-Watergate, post-Vietnam world. So as far as the Reagan coalition goes, who exactly are who's voting for him and what is what his positions are? Well, on the one hand, we have free market conservatives. We might call this the like pro-business crowd, right? This is the no regulation. So the anti-environmentalists can get behind this. This is no/lower taxes on this side. So anyone who favored kind of a hands-off economic approach, lower taxes, lower regulations, lower welfare spending. So pro-business, pro-low taxes, no regulation on the environment. That made up one part of it. The second part is the neoconservative wing, and this is also a way that Reagan differed from earlier presidents. The neoconservatives, we can call them the Cold Warriors. Reagan did not have what was called sometimes Vietnam syndrome. Vietnam was a big blow to the confidence of the United States. Americans, after that war was over, questioned whether or not they should intervene in parts around the world, whether they could do right, whether they should do it. Reagan was not affected by it. He continued to maintain the idea that America is always a force of good in the world and should always be everywhere at once. The neoconservatives or the Cold Warriors wanted an aggressive foreign policy. Think about this in the aftermath of Afghanistan and the aftermath of the Iranian Revolution. And they wanted an escalation of the Cold War. Ever since Richard Nixon came into office and his détente policy, relaxation, Carter kind of leading by goodwill. Carter came into office really kind of wanting to soften Soviet-American tensions, but when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, it was like, okay, well, obviously, if they're going to be aggressive, then the United States needs to be aggressive too. So Reagan got his support from pro-business, aggressive Cold Warriors, and then lastly the Christian right, traditional values. And Reagan sort of echoed these sentiments. He advocated for prayer in the classroom. Reagan was against abortion. So these are kind of the three legs of the new conservative movement. And if you're to combine them all together, that's kind of what we mean by the new right, right? It's kind of these sort of beliefs, a belief in the free market, kind of a throwback to your old school Gilded Age approach, like of the 1920s and even earlier than that. It is a view on foreign policy that is much more aggressive. It's a view on foreign policy that's much more confident, right? Not affected by Vietnam syndrome. And it's, fighting the culture wars on one side, and that is aligning with groups like the religious right, the Christian coalition, et cetera, et cetera. Now, when Reagan came into office early in his presidency, he proved to be a rather popular president initially. One thing that Reagan had going for him was that he brought sort of the whole Hollywood persona with him. He was sometimes referred to as the great communicator, or his ability to sort of speak with Americans. He also had the Hollywood charisma. Reagan also freed the hostages. And in 1981, he survived an assassination attempt. Reagan was shot in the stomach. The would-be assassin missed his target. The bullet hit a car and then planted itself in Reagan's stomach. And after he had survived the assassination attempt, he had joked about it afterwards. And that made him much more sympathetic president. The fact that he continued his presidency, the assassination attempt of, not attempt, but the assassination of Kennedy, still somewhat fresh in the minds of Americans. And, the fact that Reagan not only survived it, but continued to fulfill his role as president and then could even like kind of joke about it afterwards. It made him, pretty liked amongst the American public early on, right? Early on in his presidency. Now, of all of Reagan's policies, and there are a few that we're going to mention here, probably the one most unique is his approach to economics. And Reagan has an approach to economics that you haven't seen in the United States really since, really since the presidents of the 1920s, right? It's been a good 60 years. Now, as far as economics go, again, we don't need like a complete class on economics to sort of understand this, but there's there's sort of two major sides when it comes to the economic debate in terms of what drives the economy. And it is the two sides that are, related to consumption, and that is supply versus demand. And the supply side, these are the people who consume or purchase, and demand side is, sorry, I'm totally wrong right. The supply side is the side that produces, and the demand side is the side that consumes. Right? So you have buyers and sellers and buyers. So for the prevailing part of, and the question really is which side drives the economy, right? When it comes to like making government policy, should policies be aimed at creating favorable conditions for suppliers, that is favoring businesses, or should we create policies that create conditions that are better for consumers, right? The people that buy stuff. And for the most part, when it came to this economic debate, it was this demand side that pretty much dominated from 1932. That was FDR, really all the way until 1980, and that was through Carter. Even Eisenhower and Richard Nixon, they had still kind of favored this demand side. And we see this in terms of like government jobs and welfare programs, right? You're trying to give relief or aid to consumers. Reagan favors this supply side. And in fact, Reagan's kind of, policy in regards to the economy is so unique that his approach even gets sort of named after him. Supply side economics, we'll just say, is a type of economics to provide, we'll just say, like most favorable conditions for business. Right, that's the idea. Is you want to make things easier for the supplier. So what does this look like? Well, it looks like, lower taxes, let businesses keep their own money, lower regulations. Typically also means anti-union. Workers' unions are good for advocating for higher pay for workers, but if you're somebody who prioritizes the business or the supply side and you want to create something that is more favorable to businesses, well, destroying unions is a good way of doing that because now workers can get paid less, and that has the effect of keeping, kind of leaving more resources for the suppliers. This type of economics, supply side economics, is also sometimes referred to as trickle down economics. Now, admittedly, trickle down is probably used more by the critics of this type of economic approach. So we might say term used by critics to describe Reaganomics. Again, this is kind of redundant, but just go ahead and add this: lower taxes, lower regulation. It's also cut spending, specifically welfare. If we go back to Reagan's initial quote here, government is not the solution to our problems. Government is the problem. Reaganomics seeks to reduce size and scope of government. Right? Yeah. So hallmarks include tax cuts, deregulation, and beginning in the 1930s, really after 1983, the economy improved. I mean, so much so that really, the economic recovery of the United States, it depends on kind of what you want to refer to as, but pretty much we might say growing from 1983 until, yeah, I mean, so there's a couple of downturns sort of in the middle. We'll say 2008, right? There's the famous dot-com bubble bursting, and there's a few recessions kind of in this period. But for the most part, when we think about like American economic history, the 1980s and 1990s, and even the early 2000s are really good periods. I would say, especially the 1980s and 1990s. So Reagan got a lot of credit. Now, of course, economists and politicians and everyone else will argue over what exactly caused the economic recovery of 1983. Those who are very critical of Reagan would point to institutions like the Federal Reserve. Those that are more, we might say, view Reagan more favorably would attribute this to Reagan's policy, Reaganomics. Regardless, though, the economy did get better in the 1980s and especially in the 1990s and the thousands. Now, this was one side of it, right? Reaganomics. It was lower taxes, it was lower regulation, cutting welfare spending, reduce the size and scope of government whenever possible. But at the same time, Reagan was also a cold warrior. And so that was at the one time to cut taxes, which reduces income, but also at the same time increase military spending. And despite the tax cuts that Reagan issued to businesses, the increase in military spending, right, pretty much just these things together, led to budget deficits and national debt. All right, we'll just say about budget deficits and national debt grew during the Reagan years. Now, probably of all of the accomplishments of the Reagan presidency, has to do with foreign policy and fundamentally the ending of the Cold War. Reagan was, like we said, Reagan in the world. Reagan resumed the escalation, to say, of tension in the Cold War. And, oftentimes I would say is that Reagan, let's say, contributed to the peaceful victory over the Soviets. in the Cold War. So oftentimes that is attributed to Reagan. So when he came into office, this more kind of aggressive and frontal approach to the Soviet Union could even be heard in his rhetoric. At the time, the movie Star Wars was very famous. And so Reagan described the Soviet Union as an evil empire. We'll just say Reagan called the Soviet Union this. In earlier decades, you had a series of treaties between the Soviets and the Americans. Recall that we talked about the SALT treaties, strategic arms limitation treaties. Reagan reversed that. Well, I should say this. Reagan reversed that trend. That is the trend of reducing arms and like bringing the, sort of letting the air out of the Cold War. That was reversed. And probably of all the military projects under the Reagan administration, the one that is most closely associated with him is something called the Strategic Defense Initiative, or the SDI. And this was, I believe, a $3 billion missile defense system. So a massive increase in the increase of spending. You can see the cover of this Time magazine right here, kind of showing you a little bit of what SDI would look like or should look like. And it was rather futuristic. So, there are satellites in here. And the idea was that these satellites could shoot lasers at rockets and blow them up. And that was, that's how the United States would defend itself from a nuclear attack from the Soviet Union, that these satellites would be in the sky and they would be able to shoot lasers at these missiles and just blow them out of the air. So it was very futuristic. The 80s is kind of a culture of futurism. A lot of like themes surrounding that. In fact, so much so that when news reporters heard of this, they didn't believe such a thing could exist. It turned out they ended up being right. We never built a satellite defense system that shoots lasers, unfortunately, but it was a real program, and billions of dollars went towards its development. It's probably a good symbol of how the arms race resumed under Reagan's presidency. Journalists called the program Star Wars. Journalists will say nickname or SDI because it sounded so futuristic. And in fact, one thing that's kind of funny is that the Soviet Union, and this of course is funny in hindsight, but the Soviet Union believed that this program was going to be developed, and I wouldn't say they freaked out, but they certainly worried that their intercontinental ballistic missiles would not be any good, and so they needed to spend more money on their military. And if you do want to give credit to Reagan for this peaceful victory in the Cold War, I think the strongest argument that you have is that when the United States increased its arms race, it's sort of by fact had also increased the Soviet Union. For every dollar that the United States spent on its military, the Soviet Union had to respond in kind, right? It couldn't back down. And the ultimate question that kind of arose out of this was whose economy could handle the stress? Whose economy could handle the stress of resuming the arms race? And while it's true, yes, the United States did grow a pretty healthy deficit and debt from the increase in military spending. The Soviet economy at the end, it was their economy that the wheels fell off first, right? And so, Reagan gets some. I think again, if you want to make the argument that Reagan ended the Cold War, this is probably the strongest argument that that one can make. Reagan's approach to the rest of the world, not just the Soviet Union, more confrontational, more aggressive, resuming the arms race. He also went back on like what Nixon and others earlier had done. Your textbook calls this the Reagan Doctrine, and that is to combat communism by sending aid and military support. around the world. And the opposite of what Vietnam had, opposite of what the lessons of Vietnam should have taught us, right? The lessons of Vietnam was that these types of wars and interventions weren't worth it. Reagan did not believe that. In 1984, Reagan won a pretty easy victory. You might say that Reagan, with the slogan of, and this was his slogan, morning, or he said it's morning in America. They easily won re-election. So if Reagan contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union, what were the reasons why the Cold War ended? Well, again, we here in the United States, we would probably like to think that we had a role to play, and that's certainly true. But probably the thing most responsible for the decline of the Soviet Union, or the person most responsible for the decline of the Soviet Union, was actually the Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev. And Gorbachev, he became premier, was like the leader, in 1985. And more than anyone else, contributed to the downfall of the Soviet Union. In fact, as far as the Cold War goes, Cold War ends in 1989. And that came, that came pretty much as like a shock to most people at the time. It wasn't as if it was very clear that the Soviet Union was collapsing. It almost happened overnight, but there were some serious problems in the Soviet Union, and we'll go ahead and kind of list three of them here. One was that earlier invasion in Afghanistan. We mentioned earlier that when the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was like their Vietnam, it dragged on for several years. They were fighting a guerrilla war. The fighters in Afghanistan, the Mujahideen, were being funded by the United States, so they had pretty much unlimited money and unlimited weapons, much in the same way that the Viet Cong did. And the Soviets found themselves unable to, suppress the, the guerrilla movement, and eventually they had to retreat from Afghanistan in a similar way that the United States retreated from Vietnam. So a long, costly war that did not do them a lot of favors in terms of winning the hearts and minds. The second thing, we'll say a second thing, are really the harsh and oppressive laws. And this had been pretty much the case from the get-go. But, as time went on, I would say it probably just compounded. So, there were no laws in the Soviet Union that guaranteed freedom of speech, for example, or freedom of the press. Laws related to the economy that did not allow for any type of private enterprise. So already, even outside of the Soviet Union, especially in the Eastern Bloc and in places like Eastern Europe, there were people who had wanted kind of a much more freer and open society, right? Especially with things like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and other things. But probably the most significant one is the economic decline. And the Soviet economy was nothing short of a mess. Everything was centrally planned. It didn't respond well to the demands of consumers. By prohibiting or limiting things like individual ownership, it meant that there were no. It meant that the economy was very slow to react to consumer demands. When everything is centrally planned, central planners dictate or get to make certain rules in terms of what gets made, how much gets made, And by doing that, you're not having kind of like the same mechanisms for things like, like price control. And so, at the time, the Soviet Union had what was probably the largest black market in the history of the world. That was the buying and selling of things that were illegal, right? Illegal. And so the economic decline had a lot to do with it. And you especially see this when comparing and contrasting places like Eastern Germany and Western Germany, the same place at the end of World War II, but very different economic circumstances. West Germany doing pretty well, Eastern Germany not all that well. And so it's sort of inheriting all these problems that Mikhail Gorbachev, in somewhat in a very ironic way, tries to save the Soviet Union, but in trying to save the Soviet Union, actually sows the seeds of its demise. So, in order to address these problems, Mikhail Gorbachev came into the Soviet Union with some reforms. And of those reforms included glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost was the idea to permit limited freedom of speech and the press. So the Soviets were going to give up, the Communist Party was going to give up control of some of the radio stations and newspapers and let journalists say a few things, right? Let the journalists criticize the Soviet government a little bit. Well, when you allow for just a little bit of freedom of speech, a little bit of freedom of the press, a little bit of criticizing the government, the door just gets blown completely wide open, and it became sort of a free for all for criticizing the state, especially in the press. Same thing is true for perestroika. This would permit limited, we'll say limited capitalism, right? To allow for a little bit of private ownership. Now, again, there was already a black market going on, but it turned out, or one of the capitalism, one of the consequences of allowing a little bit of capitalism meant that when consumers were given the choice, it was not the state-sponsored economy that thrived. It was kind of the individual economies that thrived. And so in the same way that by allowing for a little bit of freedom of speech and allowing for a little bit of capitalism, it just kind of blew the doors wide open, and people, instead of being satisfied with the little bit that they had, actually came to demand more, right? They wanted more capitalism, more freedom of speech. They wanted all the protections that were enjoyed by the democracies of the world, and the protests against these things just grew stronger and stronger. So again, what's kind of ironic about both of these things is that these were reforms by Gorbachev to save the failing Soviet Union. It was only in his effort to save it that he ended up killing it. And so by the late 1980s, the protest against the Soviet system had only grown stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger. Meanwhile, Reagan, who had taken such a harsh approach and such a harsh posture against the Soviets, actually toned down his rhetoric quite a bit. So much so that Reagan and Gorbachev actually became friends. The most sort of unlikely partnership. And Reagan even visited Moscow in the Soviet Union. Here is Reagan shaking the hands of a young boy with a very suspicious tourist looking on. And they asked him when he visited Moscow, they say, "Hey, wait a minute, Reagan, didn't you call this place the evil empire?" And he pretty much said, "Look, that was a different time." And it was kind of through the ending of his presidency, the more softer approach, the diplomacy between Reagan and Gorbachev, that the falling apart of the Soviet Union took place, and it fell apart without a single shot being fired. Well, take that back. There were some shots that were fired, but it fell apart without any war happening, and the Cold War came to an end. And in the aftermath, some people have remarked that because of the scale of the Cold War, maybe, and the dangerous brinksmanship that was there, that it was a foregone conclusion that a war would one day break out. And yet the Cold War came to an end without a single nuclear missile being fired off or even a direct shot between the Soviets and the Americans. And for that to happen was somewhat of a miracle. So how did all this stuff unfold? Well, first, it unfolded in Eastern Europe. These were the Iron Curtain nations. And by 1989, every country we'll say overthrew their communist government. There was only one country in which it wasn't peaceful, but for the most part, every single communist state government in Eastern Europe was peacefully overthrown. And, democratic, capitalistic governments were put into place. I believe that country was Romania, was the only country where the communist leader was shot and killed. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. This was the symbol of the Cold War. It divided East and West Berlin. Essentially, the people of Germany went out to the wall and started tearing it down, and the guards did nothing. They allowed for this to take place. Gorbachev, in some respect, as this was all taking place, his response was pretty much to do nothing. And this was a very dramatic departure from earlier policies that the Soviet Union had. Their policy, whereas the United States was to contain communism, the Soviet Union was always to protect communism. And in earlier time periods, when it came to Hungary, when students of Hungary protested against communism, when it came to, Czechoslovakia, let's see if we can, Czechoslovakia, in 1968, when they protested against communism, the response by the Soviets was to, quote unquote, send in the tanks. And both anti-communist revolutions in Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia in 1968, these were crushed by the Soviet military. This time in 1989, the difference is Gorbachev is not sending in the tanks and allowing these rebellions to turn into just outright overthrows of the communist government. In fact, members of the Communist Party were so pissed at Gorbachev that they held him hostage, right? Because he was allowing for all of this to take place. Now, when the Berlin Wall fell, this really was what historians consider the end of the Cold War, because that wall, because it was such a strong symbol, its physical destruction meant that the Cold War was over. Now, the size and scope of the fall of communism was limited. While it's true that in Eastern Europe, later on in the Soviet Union, in Germany, communism would fall, anti-communist protesters in China attempted to take the momentum of anti-communist sentiment and do the same thing in China. However, there, they were brutally crushed. In Tiananmen Square, I want to say 1989, I think it was 89, it might be 88, but I'm going to say 1989. Anti-communist revolt was crushed by the Chinese communists. So China would remain communist, right? Communism would not fall there. It would fall everywhere else, right? But not China. And from the Tiananmen Square protests, we get this very famous image. This guy right here who is standing in front of the tanks, called Tank Man. And Tank Man became a very powerful symbol in, I would say, the Western world, right? This image is celebrated tremendously by Americans and other groups of people and nations that are sympathetic to the American cause, right? The individual standing up against the oppressive army of communism. But unfortunately, for those in China who revolted against the communist government, they would not see any dramatic change. A little while later, by 1999, so once communism had fell in Eastern Europe, by 1999, the Soviet Union collapsed, fractured into Russia. Plus, I want to say 13 other countries. The number might be slightly wrong. But we can see here at the map a little bit of what this looks like. So these are our Eastern European countries here, right? This is the old Iron Curtain. Now, all these countries right here, Bulgaria, Romania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, those nations were always independent, right? So that's not the Soviet Union. Those countries were always independent, but the Soviets had so much control that they installed communist governments there. And if the people of Poland or Czechoslovakia or Hungary ever wanted to change that, well, we know what the answer was, right? The antidote to revolution in Eastern Europe. By 1989, all of those countries had gotten rid of their communist governments peacefully, except for Romania. Now, the Soviet Union is this darker red blob here. So out of the Soviet Union came the country of Russia, but also 13 other countries. So Kazakhstan, for example, was a new nation. Georgia, Armenia, Uzbekistan, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union previously. So the dissolution and Russia itself too also became an anti-communist. Kind of. I guess you can't really call it democratic because Russia is not really the the hallmark of democracy, but it wasn't the same old Soviet system. Now, as far as Reagan's presidency goes, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the victory in the Cold War, this is kind of in line with the economic recovery that happened and why Americans liked him. However, though, the Reagan presidency was rocked with one scandal in particular, one that threatened to maybe kind of throw the entire presidency off the rails, and this was the Iran-Contra scandal. Now, the Iran-Contra scandal never really affected Reagan's presidency in the same way that Watergate did, but it did kind of bring back nightmares for many Americans of kind of the same old corrupt politics. Now, the Iran-Contra scandal is a little bit more, I would say maybe a little bit more complicated, but let us recall that Iran, post-revolution, had an anti-American government. In fact, the Reagan administration had called it or labeled the Iranians terrorists. The Contras are anti-communist fighters in Central America. And this is a group of people that, according to the Reagan doctrine, Reagan would very much like to provide support for the Contras because they were fighting against communism. However, because of Vietnam, Congress banned support to the Contras. So the Reagan presidency was not allowed to sell weapons to the Contras, for example, but still wanted to support them and believed that they could support them secretly, and hence the Iran-Contra scandal was born. So the Iran-Contra scandal, in kind of its definitional form, so this is maybe like the background information to it. Iran-Contra, and maybe we'll just put it in a different color here. Iran-Contra is the selling of weapons to Iran So you're already selling weapons to a state designated as a terrorist state, and then to use the money to support the Contras. And this was all done in secret. So Congress had banned support to the Contras. Iran was a terrorist state, according to the United States. And so the Iran-Contra scandal was selling weapons to Iran and then using the money to support the Contras. And so when the Senate opened up investigations about the Iran-Contra affair, the question was, just like question was with Watergate, how involved was the president? Did the president play a central role? And this is the difference between Watergate and the Contra. And that is, as far as our evidence goes, Reagan mostly did not have a role in the scandal. Reagan was probably not even maybe informed about it, but certainly didn't have a role in organizing it. It wasn't in line with his approach to the presidency. Reagan was not the guy for the details. He was a guy that drew pictures during presidential meetings. He was good about talking about like the big ideas, but never very particular with the specifics. Meanwhile, Richard Nixon was certainly the mad scientist behind every action throughout his administration. So even though Americans came to suspect Reagan of wrongdoing here, and in fact, he earned his most unfavorable percentage during the Iran-Contra scandal, Iran-Contra never killed Reagan's presidency. You could say maybe it tarnished his legacy a bit. It still gets mentioned in history textbooks, but it wasn't anything like Watergate. Watergate was far larger. The president was much more involved in Watergate. The president even covered up the wrongdoings. There were some people that went to jail for the Iran-Contra scandal, but they were more or less pardoned after presidency. So Reagan had served a rather successful 8 years. The Soviet Union was on the pathway of dissolution. The economy was recovering. Americans felt in some ways they had gotten over Vietnam. Some confidence was restored. And so in the 1988 election, George W. Bush wins the presidency. George W. Bush was the VP, I'll say vice president. The vice president of Reagan. And he won the 1988 election. And won it, not a landslide or anything like that. The vote was like 55-45, which 55-45 is pretty good for a presidential election, but you can go ahead and see the electoral map here and the breakdown of the popular vote. Bush's slogan for his election campaign was "Read my lips, no new taxes." This is Bush's 1988 campaign slogan. But Bush's presidency would hit a few more road bumps than Reagan's. One we can point to is that Bush did end up raising taxes, breaking his slogan. So many Americans kind of pointed to that, right? You very famously said, "Read my lips, no new taxes," and then in governing the next 4 years, signed on to legislation that essentially raised taxes. But probably one of the issues that Bush faced in a way that he was unlike Reagan is he did not have the same charisma. George H.W. Bush arguably, might be one of the most well-qualified presidents in history. He was literally the youngest American pilot in World War II. He had served in World War II fighting the Japanese. I think 19 years old, he was flying missions. He was Ivy League educated, Yale University, I want to say. He had served as head of the CIA. So if you want to talk about the most powerful person in the United States, George H.W. Bush was director or head of the CIA, and he was Reagan's vice president. So this guy had all the qualifications, but he was just kind of missing that sort of element that made Reagan popular, and not so much George H. Bush. Very shortly into his presidency, though, George H.W. Bush is breaking records for the most popular president in U.S. history as far as like approval ratings go. And this ends up being a very important kind of event in terms of setting the trend in the post-Cold War world, because nobody quite knows exactly what the new world's going to be like. Bush uses this slogan called New World Order. This is the idea that after the fall of the Soviet Union, right, what's going to come after the Cold War? And nobody really knows what the world's going to be like. But George H.W. Bush says this is a new world order. And in many ways, what the New World Order means is that U.S. intervention will continue. You know, there's a question about whether the United States might go back to like a more of an isolationist foreign policy. That's not the case. And the U.S., in some ways, acts sort of like a police of the world. And the most clear example of this is the Gulf War. And the Gulf War provides us an early yet important example of the way that the United States will continue to interact in the world, and that is in a very, very sort of interventionist method. So the Gulf War, this happened in 1991. This was a war between Iraq versus United States and their allies. And the United States had a lot of allies in this conflict. At the time, the United States, U.S., was left as the world's lone superpower. The Soviet Union is gone. The Soviet Union has collapsed. This communist, capitalist, East versus West, black and white, the way that the world had been defined for so long, that time was now over. And so the United States kind of stood as, the lone superpower of the world. And if we were to track this back even further, I mean, we might even point back to like World War II, for example. So, back in World War II, you had, capitalism and democracy. You had communism, and then you had fascism, right? These were kind of the three orientations that countries could take. World War II saw the defeat of fascism. The Cold War saw the defeat of communism. And so, many Americans and just people more broadly said, look, this is the way that it's going to be from here on out. In fact, some people even use the term the end of history. Like, this is it. Capitalism and democracy won. Game over, right? This is the end. This is the end of history as we know it. And so a lot of ambiguity in terms of what the world would look like. But the United States proved that it'd be willing to intervene. So the Gulf War happened when Saddam Hussein was we'll call him the military dictator of Iraq. And he ordered an invasion of a much smaller country called Kuwait. And Kuwait was an oil-rich, small nation, small country, invaded by Iraq. And the U.S. response to Saddam Hussein invading a small country in Iraq was to come to the defense of Kuwait. Right, that was the response, right, to be a sort of be like a policing force of some sorts. Now, the US response to the Gulf War in 1991, or the first Iraq War as it's sometimes called, is important for two reasons. One is the coalition, and that was the United States got widespread support to attack Iraq. We're talking not just support at home between Republicans and Democrats, which is certainly important, but even the Soviet Union, which was still breathing its last breaths, and other Arab nations supported the United States' decision to invade Iraq, or at least save Kuwait, right? We'll put it that way. And the second point was that this was a very fast U.S. victory. The sheer time that it took for the United States to beat Iraq, which at the time was the U.S. military was obviously very large, but Iraq was a pretty heavily militarized country. I think it might have been like the fifth largest military in the world or something like that. And the United States won in 5 days. It was a complete one-sided slaughter, essentially. And the United States made no mistakes about it. They mobilized, I think, a 500,000 soldiers. So this was not just like the Persian Gulf War was not just like, a CIA operation or kind of a small scale thing. I mean, the United States mobilized its military in kind of a very serious way. If we break down the fatalities, 141 Allied deaths, 100,000 Iraqi deaths. So, the fatalities tell the story. Now, unfortunately for George H.W. Bush, though, even though he was experiencing, a huge kind of surge in popularity due to the Persian Gulf War, Americans forgot that pretty quickly. And already in the election of 1992, Bush was under some pressure, and you might say that one of the things holding him back was his kind of lack of charisma. And maybe most importantly, though, in 1993 was the emergence of a third-party candidate who really spoiled George H.W. Bush's reelection. So Bush was running against Bill Clinton, who was the Democrat, a two-term governor of Arkansas. And, Bill Clinton was kind of a youthful and charismatic candidate. I believe that he was, I think, the second youngest president behind Kennedy and Teddy Roosevelt. But he was kind of coming in as a new candidate, right? A youthful face, a charismatic appearance, as compared to George H.W. Bush, who was not all that charismatic. But maybe most importantly was Ross Perot, and Ross Perot was like an oil businessman / billionaire. And he ran third party. And him running, he took votes away from H.W. Bush. That's probably the most significant outcome of this election. And so when the three candidates ran, the 1992 election broke down as follows. Again, as far as third-party candidates go, pretty successful. Clinton, the Democrat, if you can't quite read it, got about 40% of the vote, so not even more than 50%. H.W. Bush, the Republican, got 38% of the vote. And then Perot, the third-party candidate, right, the independent. But Perot's independence was like more Republican than it was Democrat, right? He was like taking away more Republican voters. He got about 20% of the vote. And so, had those 20% voted for H.W. Bush, he no doubt would have won. But because of the third-party candidate, Bill Clinton squeaked in to become the next president of the United States, the Democrat from Arkansas, starting in 1992.